My beloved child, something happened last night that you may never have expected. Someone who has been trying to stay quiet, someone who has been keeping their feelings carefully hidden, secretly visited your profile, and what they found there made them stop, stare, and rethink something they had convinced themselves was already finished. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the story begins to change. They did not simply look at your picture and move on. They noticed something different about you. Something in the way you have been carrying yourself. Something in your silence. Something in the energy behind the things you shared, or even the things you chose not to share. And suddenly, the person who thought they understood you realized they may have completely misunderstood you. They expected to see the old version of you, the one who was waiting, wondering, hoping, perhaps still looking back. But instead, they saw signs that you had grown. They saw strength where they expected sadness. They saw peace where they expected questions. And that realization touched a place inside them they had been trying very hard to ignore. As this unfolds, clarity will come. Because the biggest surprise is not that they visited your profile. The biggest surprise is what they were actually looking for. They were searching for one specific sign. One tiny indication that you still remembered them, that you still cared, that some invisible connection between you had not completely disappeared. But when they looked through your profile, they found something they were not prepared for. You were not where they expected you to be emotionally. You had changed. And that change made them wonder whether they had waited too long. What happened next is the part you need to hear carefully. They started looking at details they would normally ignore. A picture. A sentence. A small update. A moment where your expression looked different. Something about your presence made them pause longer than they intended. They may have entered your profile casually, telling themselves, "I am only checking for a moment." But moments became minutes. And those minutes became questions. Why do you seem different? Why do you look calmer? Why does it feel like you are moving forward? Why does seeing you suddenly bring back memories they thought they had already placed behind them? This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes the strongest emotional reaction happens when someone realizes they no longer have the same place in your life that they once had. They may have assumed you would always be there emotionally, always available to understand them, always leaving the door open. But your profile showed them something else. It showed them that you are becoming someone who no longer needs an explanation to keep moving. And that shook their certainty. Then came the thought they did not want to admit: what if I lose my chance? That single thought changed the entire feeling of the night. They went back again. They looked again. They remembered conversations. They replayed moments. They remembered the way you made them feel when nobody else could. They remembered the little things they once took for granted. And suddenly, the distance between you did not feel comforting anymore. It felt like a question waiting for an answer. Something huge is waiting for you, but before you assume it means an immediate message or a dramatic confession, understand this: the first change happens inside them. Their certainty begins to break. Their old excuses begin to feel weaker. The story they told themselves about you no longer feels complete. And there is one more layer to what they discovered. They notice that you are no longer chasing the connection the way you once did. Maybe you stopped checking. Maybe you stopped posting things meant to be noticed. Maybe you simply became quieter and started focusing on yourself. Whatever it was, they felt the difference. Your silence became louder than any message could have been. They began wondering whether you had finally released the emotional weight of waiting for them. And that possibility created a completely different kind of urgency inside their heart. They started asking themselves questions they had avoided for a long time. What if I was wrong about them? What if I misunderstood what they wanted? What if they were sincere all along? And the most difficult question of all, what if I still have feelings, but I am the reason nothing happened? That question can change everything. Because when someone realizes that the obstacle was not the connection itself, but their own hesitation, pride, confusion, or fear of being vulnerable, they can no longer blame circumstances as easily. Your profile became a mirror. It reflected something back to them that they were not ready to see. And now they are thinking differently about the past. They may remember a moment when you reached out and they stayed quiet. A moment when you needed reassurance and they gave you distance. A moment when you were trying to understand them and they gave you mixed signals. Last night, those memories may have returned with unexpected emotional weight. Not because you did anything dramatic, but because you did something far more powerful. You kept becoming yourself. Stay with me for a moment, because the next realization is where this becomes even more meaningful. They may have expected to find proof that you were still waiting for them. Instead, they found evidence that your life is continuing, and that if they truly want a place in it, they may have to stop watching from a distance and finally become honest about what they feel. So if you have been wondering why the energy around this connection feels different, remember this: sometimes the turning point does not begin with a message. Sometimes it begins with someone silently realizing what they could lose. Last night may have been that realization for them. They looked at your profile expecting information, but they found emotion. They searched for signs about your life, but they discovered something about their own heart. They wanted to know whether you still cared, and instead they discovered that they still care more than they were willing to admit. And that is why this moment matters. The story is not necessarily about someone secretly watching you. It is about someone finally seeing you clearly. As this unfolds, clarity will come. The next step may not happen exactly when you expect it, and it may not arrive in the form you imagine. But something inside this person has shifted. They are beginning to understand that silence does not erase connection, distance does not automatically erase memories, and time does not always remove feelings. Sometimes time simply reveals which feelings were real enough to survive it. Something huge is waiting for you. Not because you need to chase it, but because the truth is finally becoming harder for them to ignore. And if they return, let their actions speak louder than their curiosity. Let consistency speak louder than promises. Let genuine effort reveal whether this new realization is truly different from the past. Because you deserve more than someone secretly visiting your profile and wondering about you. You deserve someone brave enough to step forward, honest enough to speak clearly, and intentional enough to show you that they finally understand your value. And perhaps, without sending a single word last night, you gave them the strongest message of all. There is something they noticed after leaving your profile that they cannot seem to shake off, my beloved child. They closed the page, put the phone down, and tried to continue their night as if nothing had happened, but the feeling followed them. One particular thought kept returning: why does this still affect me? They had expected curiosity. They had not expected emotion. They had not expected old memories to suddenly feel so close. They may have looked at your profile again, not because they needed more information, but because they were trying to understand what had just happened inside them. And this time, they noticed something even more important. You were not trying to get their attention. You were not sending hidden signals. You were simply living your life. That realization created a strange mixture of admiration and regret. They began wondering whether the version of you they remembered was already gone. And whether the person standing before them now was someone they needed to approach differently. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where their thoughts became deeper. They started remembering the moments when you gave them chances to understand you. They remembered conversations they could have handled differently. They remembered words they left unsaid. And suddenly, the silence between you did not feel like freedom anymore. It felt like unfinished business. They began to understand that perhaps they had been looking in the wrong direction all along. They had been waiting for you to prove that you still cared, while you may have been waiting for them to prove that they were serious. Two people could have been standing on opposite sides of the same emotional bridge, both wondering why the other person was not moving. And last night, something inside them finally made them look across that bridge again. But then came the discovery that truly changed their perspective. They realized that your life did not stop because the connection became complicated. You continued growing. You continued changing. You continued becoming stronger. And perhaps they suddenly saw qualities in you that they had previously overlooked. Your patience. Your emotional depth. Your ability to remain kind without constantly demanding attention. Your ability to walk forward without publicly announcing every private battle you had overcome. That may have been the most powerful thing they found on your profile. Not a message. Not a photograph. Not a direct reference to them. It was the absence of desperation. And that absence spoke volumes. They may have thought, maybe I misunderstood their silence. Maybe your silence was not weakness. Maybe it was self-respect. Maybe you were not waiting for them to rescue the connection. Maybe you were simply allowing life to reveal what was real. This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes a person only recognizes your value after they realize they no longer have automatic access to your attention. And now they are looking at you differently. They are not simply asking whether you still have feelings. They are asking whether there is still a place for them in your future. That is a completely different question. And questions like that can change a person's behavior. They may begin thinking about what they would say if they contacted you. They may imagine how you would respond. They may wonder whether you would be warm, distant, surprised, or completely indifferent. And the uncertainty itself may be pushing them toward a decision. Because one thing became clear last night, they cannot keep assuming that time will keep everything exactly where they left it. Now, before we continue, if this message is resonating with something you have been feeling, take a second to share it with someone who needs a reminder that not every silent chapter is an ending. And if you want more messages like this, stay connected and subscribe, because sometimes the most meaningful realizations begin quietly before they become visible. Now come back with me, because there is another detail you need to understand. The person who visited your profile may have been searching for evidence of someone else. They may have wondered whether your heart had moved on. They may have looked for signs that another person had entered your world. But instead of finding a clear answer, they found something far more unsettling to their assumptions. They could not easily read you anymore. They could not tell what you were thinking. They could not tell whether you were still emotionally connected to the past or whether you had completely released it. And that uncertainty made them realize something important. They had become used to believing they knew where they stood with you. Now they are not so sure. And when certainty disappears, people often start examining the feelings they had been avoiding. They may have asked themselves why your name still creates a reaction. Why one profile visit could bring back so many memories. Why they still remember tiny details that should have faded by now. Why they still imagine conversations that never happened. Why they still wonder what could have happened if they had made different choices. These are not small questions. These are the questions that appear when someone realizes a chapter may not have been emotionally completed, even if the distance made it look finished. And here is the part that may surprise you most: their next move may begin with something extremely small. A quiet check. A subtle interaction. A sudden appearance. A message that looks casual but carries much more emotion underneath it. They may not immediately say everything they discovered. They may test the atmosphere first. They may want to know whether the door is completely closed before they reveal what is actually in their heart. So do not focus only on dramatic words. Watch for intention. Watch for consistency. Watch for whether they make an effort to understand you instead of simply satisfying their curiosity. Something huge is waiting for you, but it may arrive through a series of small moments rather than one enormous event. And perhaps that is exactly why this connection feels different now. The person who secretly visited your profile last night may have entered looking for information about you, but they left carrying questions about themselves. They discovered that time had not erased everything. They discovered that your absence had a presence of its own. They discovered that your growth had changed the balance between you. And most importantly, they discovered that if they truly want to reconnect, they cannot approach you as the same person they were before. They would have to come with greater honesty, greater clarity, and genuine effort. So breathe. Do not rush toward the answer. Let the next chapter reveal itself through actions. Because the most powerful part of this story is not that they looked at your profile. It is that, after looking at you, they finally had to look within themselves. And that is where everything begins to change.